Governance and compliance has become a key aspect of IT deployments and our IT world. And Azure can help you to manage and govern your environment with some baked-in tools that we've got available to help you with these initiatives. My name is Johan Myburgh, and I will be spending this module with you talking through some of the components of Azure governance. As you can see there, I'm an Azure technical trainer with Microsoft here in South Africa, where I present and deliver some of our courses. But you'll also see there's some contact details if you want to hook up on something like LinkedIn or whatever the case might be. Just at a high level, we will provide some sort of a Azure structure overview, right? What are the structure building blocks that we can use? Then secondly, we will also look at Azure policies, and then we will lastly look at role-based access control. Okay, so what do we have for governance? We've got the structure I mentioned, we've got policy, and we've got role-based access control. Let's just touch on these quickly. The structure is essentially a taxonomy that we can create inside of Azure that gives you a structure for you to place your resources in. The structure typically consists of management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. This is a relatively firm structure, and even though you can change it, you don't really want to make changes to the structure often. So you want to get the structure right more towards the beginning of your deployment and usage of Azure, and then fill in as you go along. The structure is used to not only apply permissions and policy, but it's also used to roll up costs, right? So everything that sits in a certain structure, those costs will be aggregated. This is a rigid structure, and it forces our end users, and in this case, end users or administrators, it forces these end users to start using, to start placing their resources in the structure. It forces them to be in line, and you can actually even remove their permissions so that they don't go and create additional structure and place resources in those structure. So those administrators, they will typically place their resources and have access somewhere in the structure. This structure is hierarchical, so it starts with a root and it expands down from that. We've also got Azure Policy, and Azure Policy consists of the actual policies themselves and also blueprints. And you'll notice that the policies are essentially a set of rules that outline how certain resources need to be deployed, but also stopping new resources from being deployed incorrectly. Right, so Azure Policy is continuously going to evaluate and scan the environment in the scope that you selected in the structure, and from there it will stop new deployments from being deployed, and it will flag non-compliant resources as non-compliant with that actual policy. RBAC or role-based access control is the last thing, and this is essentially the authentication and access component, but also who's got access to do what inside of Azure. Now this is sliced and diced using various roles. You'll see that I've got two roles there, an owner and a contributor, and these permissions are additive. In other words, if I give you permissions in the structure at a higher level, those permissions will just aggregate down the structure, right? And exactly as we said there, it inherits down the structure. But let's look at the structure that I'm talking about in a bit more detail. Now, you'll notice that this is essentially the Azure Global Network. The Azure Global Network has of course some dark fiber that's running under the oceans in our world, and you'll see there that Microsoft has got quite a bit of this. It might take a little bit of effort for you to duplicate this sort of deployment with your own organization's data centers and networking, but suffice to say, Microsoft is trying to cover the globe as far as we can. I want you to notice two things though. The first thing is most of these seem to be deployed in groups of two, right? So it looks like there are always two of these close to one another, and I'm circling these might not actually be the regional pairs, but you should get the idea. Why am I doing this? Well, because Microsoft has got the concept of a regional pair. So if I can take a look at South Africa here, we've got South Africa North and we've got South Africa West. This, for those of you who don't know, is essentially Johannesburg and Cape Town. And by the way, Cape Town is about a quarter more expensive resource wise than Johannesburg is, because all our GDP really sits in Johannesburg. But you will notice that South Africa West and South Africa North are paired. And what that means is if South Africa North goes down, certain services in South Africa West will still be up and running and available for us to use. What happens inside of one of these regions? It's quite straightforward. We start with one zone, and all the resources that require one zone will be able to get deployed in that new region. Over time, though, Microsoft will start adding a second zone and up to a third zone. And this is essentially where we stop. We can outfit a region with up to 3 zones, and one of these zones is essentially a data center or a facility that is completely separate from the other zones. So strictly speaking, what should happen is if this zone goes down, this zone and zone 3 will still be up and running. So it's possible to deploy your resources across these zones so that within a single region, you've got that DR capability and high availability. We've already touched on this a little bit, but the Azure building blocks are essentially components that Microsoft give to you inside the Azure platform to ensure that you can create some structure and you can leverage some of these components to provide some sort of an environment that scales over time and that your end users can manage without having to, give too granular permissions. First of all, we've essentially got the the Azure region, as we started talking about, and each of these regions, as we said, is paired with another region, right? You don't choose that region, we choose the region. But when you deploy your resources, you do get to choose your region, right? And all of this kind of sits in the same tenant. So we've got the regional pair that we select, and then we've got geographies. So essentially, Microsoft has just split the globe into a couple of geographies, and that allows us to slice and dice the planet essentially. And there you'll see we've also got the zones, up to 3 of them, that will essentially give me some additional capability within a region. And then we've got a logical architecture here that I've created, and the logical architecture talks to the different components in the building blocks that we've got for the structure. And you'll see there they are. We've got management groups, we've got subscriptions and resource groups. Those are the building blocks that I'm talking about, and your resources will live inside of those resource groups. So it's a combination of management groups, subscription, and resource groups that you've got to provision some sort of a structure that your administrators need to adhere to. Of course, all of this is covered by the entire tenant, which was created when you created your first subscription, right? And a tenant usually has at least one account, and that account gives us access into that subscription or tenant, or wherever you do have permissions in this context. All right, so let's quickly take a pause here and talk about management groups. Management groups is a hierarchical structure that you can create that's got up to 6 levels deep. In other words, you can go and create a hierarchical structure that has got 6 layers, and you can fit your business into this structure. If you think about this, you might, for example, have something like HR. Under HR, you might have a payroll, and you might also have some other components, and then you might have something like IT, and IT might be split into operational side and into a dev side. And this structure will allow you to go and place your subscriptions strategically inside of the structure, and that will allow me to not only assign permissions to anyone who needs access to everything inside of HR, but it will allow me to roll up and manage different subscriptions at the same time. So there you can see under payroll, we might have 4 subscriptions, right? There might be some additional subscriptions. Subscriptions can be scattered all around the structure, right? And that allows us to manage multiple subscriptions. A subscription, on the other hand, this item here, is not a hierarchical structure. It is just a flat one layer component in the building blocks that make up the entire structure. So you sit with management groups, and then inside of those management groups, you will have subscriptions. And remember, a subscription is a mechanism for me to say to Microsoft, hey, I want to use some of your services. This is how I'm going to pay for them. And then last but not least, we've got resource groups. And resource groups are the lowest layer in the building blocks, and resource groups contain your actual resources. Resources cannot live inside of a subscription or a management group. They have to live inside resource groups. So your individual resource, like your virtual machines, will always be placed in a resource group. This is typically also where you want to assign something like permissions, for example. You want to avoid assigning permissions at granular level down at individual resource level, right? That doesn't scale over time. So there's these three building blocks. We spoke about management groups, we spoke about subscriptions, and there's individual resource groups. Shall we take a look at these quickly? I've got the Azure portal open here, and you'll see here that if I search for management groups is one of the options that arrive there. And you'll see if I click on my management groups here, you will see that there's some structure. There's the root management group. If I expand that, there's the worldwide commercial business. There's worldwide learning, where I made a typo in, and then there's global technical learning. And you'll see inside global technical learning, there is actually one child subscription. Right, so nothing is stopping me here actually from taking one of these management groups, moving the group around, moving the subscriptions around in the structure. And what you really want is you want to end up with that scenario where you've got some sort of a hierarchical structure, and your structure then contains all the individual resources, um, and it is easier to manage like this. So think about it like this. With this structure, you can go and place multiple resources all around the structure, and you can unpack it and scale it to the point where you don't have to put everything into one resource group, everything into one subscription, right? You want to use these components to unpack your environment to the point where in 2-3 years time you can still be adding resources, and you don't have to worry about moving resources between resource groups, etc. All right, so let's come back to my management group. Here you can see I've got management groups. In fact, if I go to my my personal account here, you'll see I've also got a personal account where I've got a subscription, and in this subscription I've actually got access to these management groups. So if I go and search for management groups here, you will see that there are a couple. So there's the structure. I've got a tenant root group, and then I've got sales, marketing, and IT. And inside of IT, I've got dev, and you'll see inside of dev there's actually a subscription, right? So if I click on subscriptions there you'll see my Azure Pass sponsorship. Right, so these groups, management groups, also allow me to, for example, if I click on marketing here, you'll see that we've got access control, and I can go and give access to the marketing resource group by clicking on add a role assignment, and this will allow me to add permissions and add access to this individual item, and those permissions will inherit into subgroups, but also into subscriptions that make part of this management group. So let me navigate up to the top here again, and you will see that we've essentially got two child subscriptions. There's Azure Pass, and that's under the root. But if I go and look at IT here, you'll see that there is a child subscription in there. It's called Visual Studio Enterprise. So if I look at these structures, management groups give me the ability to create that hierarchical structure that we spoke about, and in there you will see there's my actual subscription, right? So if I click on Visual Studio Enterprise, you will see that there's the subscription overview, there's some costing information, etc. There's some cost alerts and budgets, and if I scroll down here, you will see that there is my resource groups, right? So there's the rest of the structure. I've got my management groups, and you'll see there's my management groups inside my inside my my breadcrumb there, and you'll see inside IT I've got my Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, and that contains essentially all of these individual resource groups. And then I can click on these individual resource groups like always on here, and you will see inside always on there's a storage account called myburgh@gmail.com. This is effectively the leaf item in the structure. This is the actual resource itself, and it lives inside of that management group. So at any point in this hierarchical structure, I can click on access control, and I can go and add role assignments and give access to this, to a given resource or to an area inside the structure. So just to take a step back here, we did a demo briefly. We spoke about management groups. I did show you some of that and that structure. We did touch a little bit on subscriptions, and last but not least, there's also the actual resource groups that we spoke about. Next up, I'd like to touch a little bit on Azure Policies. And Azure Policies is essentially a management tool we find inside of Azure that will allow us to apply different policies and rules to our structures and resources and make sure that they are consistent in terms of their deployment, consistent in terms of how we manage them, etc. So inside policies, we've essentially got policies and initiatives. There's a one-to-many relationship between this. You can have one initiative and you can have multiple policies behind that. The reason for this is you'll see that you can have many policies, hundreds of policies, and if you have to assign each of them individually, it'll be a big pain in the neck. So we give you initiatives, and initiatives allow you to roll up those policies and apply just one initiative, and it'll contain multiple policies. These policies are created and assigned, as you can see there. And once they're assigned, they will start the evaluation process and evaluate the scope that they're applied at, and start reporting back on items that are not within scope or not compliant for that matter. Right, so during your deployment of resources, when you are provisioning a new resource, Azure Resource Manager is actually going to look at that deployment, look if there are policies that are stopping you from doing that, and it will then stop that deployment before it goes ahead. So there's policies that so while you're doing deployment, we are also evaluating the policies and seeing if this deployment of yours is actually going to stick or not. Some of the use cases around this specify things like resource types you want to deploy, the different SKUs you want to allow for virtual machines, as you can see there, restrict the locations you want to use. You can use policies for all these things. You can even use policies to require tags and values on individual resources so that you can classify them outside of the structure. And then you'll also see verify whether something like Azure Backup has in fact been deployed or not. Let's take a look at Azure Policy and do a little demo, shall we? Back to Visual Studio again, and in fact this time I'm going to go back to my Azure subscription again on the Microsoft tenant, and I'm just going to type policy here, and you will see immediately it comes back with policies. All right, it comes back with a bit of a dashboard here that shows me a bunch of things that are compliant and a bunch of things that are non-compliant. Right, now this is not something that happens quickly. If you create a new policy assignment, it takes a little bit of time before that policy assignment actually comes into play here, and switching off one of these assignments also takes a little bit of time. Now, just to get started, I want us to take a look at the assignments here, and you'll see that there has been 5 assignments to date here. 4 of them I did on my own subscription. 1 of them is actually coming from the root. So this is something that was applied by Microsoft, not by me. right? And then you'll see I've got some definitions. Now, these definitions are essentially a long list. There's a new policy definition, there's a new initiative definition, and remember, an initiative contains multiple policies. But if I filter here based on policies, you'll see that there's a hell of a lot of policies, right? And if I go and search further and I search for something like VM, then there will be a bunch of policies relating to virtual machines. Now, what you might decide to do is you might decide that you want a separate policy for your dev environment, maybe a separate policy for your UAT environment. So you will then go and create one of these initiatives, and you will go and assign an initiative for dev, assign a new initiative for UAT, and those initiatives will then contain all the policy definitions that you want to assign to dev and to UAT, etc. As you can see here, there's things like manage disk, deploy log analytics agents for Linux, audit VMs that do not use managed disks. There's a whole bunch of them, and that's why initiatives are important. Otherwise, you end up with hundreds of policies you're managing and assigning individually. But take a look here, deploy the Windows guest configuration extension, add system assigned managed identity, only approved VM extensions should be installed. Let's take a look at this one. So here you can see only approved VM extensions should be installed. This is an interesting one, and you'll see here I've actually got a policy definition, right? So this is really just a JSON file that has got the policy outline and the name, the policy type, etc. all in here. And you'll see here there's approved extensions, and and you'll see there this list approves some of your extensions. And if I click on the assign option here, you'll notice that I can go and specify the scope I want to assign it to. There you can see I can start with my ATT sub scope, and I can optionally go and apply it to a resource group if I wanted to. Right? I'm not going to apply it to a resource group now, but what I am going to do here is I'm going to apply it to my ATT sub. I can specify some exclusions if I wanted to. So if I wanted to, I can go and add this policy, but I can actually stop it from evaluating certain resources that I might be having. Only certain extensions, of course, I can go and provide a proper description here, right? So everyone knows what the policy does. And if I scroll down a little bit here, you'll see that it's assigned, it's actually being enforced. And if I click on the next button here, you'll see that I've got my parameters, the effect, audit, approved extensions. What extensions do you want? And you can see here that I can specify something like, something like PowerShell desired state configuration might be one of the items I want to add, and this will allow me to specify what extensions I'm going to be allowing in that scope. So if PowerShell desired state configuration is one of them, it will essentially allow that. All right, this is maybe not the best example because I need some defined values here. But if I go up into my search here and I search for something like tags, then you'll see that there's append a tag and its value to resource group, add a tag to resource group. Let's take this one. There again is my policy definition, and if I click on assign here, you will see that once again it allows me to specify the scope. I can go and specify my ATT sub, optionally specify a resource group if I wanted to. There's my exclusions again. Add a tag to resources, and if I hit the next button here, you'll see here I can specify that the course, the tag name must be course, and the value must be AZ, let's say 104, the administrator course for that matter. And then you'll see I've got next. There's some remediation here. So in other words, if that tag is not on certain resources, we can actually now take it a step further, and we can go and say, but all right, well, we want to remediate this, and we want to create a remediate task here, which is going to add it to resources automatically. And I'm going to place this somewhere in West Europe. And what this policy will do is it will, you are not adding the course tag to resources. Right, so what it's actually going to do is it's going to apply this policy and start evaluating, but where it doesn't find the policy, it will actually go and apply this tag without me having to do anything. So there you can see, if I click on policy, there's under my assignments, there's a new one, inherit a tag from the subscription if missing. And there's a couple of them, but here is the one I just added. Add a tag to resources, and you will see that it's not going to, it's actually, if I click on overview here, it is not going to start reporting on that immediately. It will take a little bit of time for that. You'll see not started, but over a couple of minutes, it's going to start applying that tag to the environment. So there you can see all the assignments that have already been done, and you can also see which of my resources are not compliant. By the way, if I go back to my overview here, it does allow me to drill down, and if I click on audit VMs with a pending reboot, it will actually come back and tell me which of my servers. There you go. AZ204 PowerShell is the virtual machine I created yesterday. This virtual machine is not compliant, right? And it shows me which of my resources are not compliant. That's important. There's no point in evaluating if we are not showing you which of those resources are not compliant. And you'll see there, if I click on compliance reason, it will tell me exactly why it's not compliant. Of course, this one doesn't look like it's got that it doesn't look like it's got the automatic remediation, but you'll see under my remediation area here, under policy, I can see which policies do allow that remediation that I specified. In other words, add the tag if it's not there. If it's not a managed disk, convert it to a managed disk, right? So we can remedy some of these things with remediation and policies. And this brings me essentially to the last part of the presentation here, and that's RBAC, role-based access control. Role-based access control is our capability to specify that, in my Azure environment, I'm planning to give these users this access in the structure. Now remember, we've got this big structure, right? We've got this big hierarchical structure that might contain multiple resources and resource groups and things like that. But at the end of the day, you still need to go and assign permissions to the structure. So role-based access control allows me, in this big structure that we've been talking about, to target a given area and to specify that user A is going to have let's say in this case, full control, and those permissions will then inherit down the structure. The inheritance model is additive. In other words, the inheritance is not going to if I, for example, give you read access and write access at that layer, and I just give you read access downwards in the structure, you will still have read write because the permissions are additive. You can overwrite these permissions, but the default RBAC capability doesn't allow you to do that. If you want to override the permissions at a lower level, you need to use Azure Blueprints to do that. All right, so here you'll see we've got two types of roles. We've got, of course, I mentioned the role definition. We'll talk about that. You can see an example of that on the right-hand side here, where I've got, for example, and then I've got my different roles. There's RBAC roles inside of Azure. This is for assigning permissions to Azure itself. And then you'll see there's Azure AD roles, which is more for Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365 scenarios. And you'll see if you have Microsoft 365, you will see some additional roles inside of Azure AD, which do not pertain to RBAC. They pertain to Microsoft 365. I'll give you an example, right? something like exchange admin. Those are roles that you will get through Microsoft 365, but they're also role definitions inside of Azure. Okay, these role definitions can be imported and created. We don't just have the default ones inside of Azure. You can go and create your own definitions and assign them. And these, and as I mentioned, they do inherit down the structure. So these permissions are additive. I'm going to crack open a little demo here quickly, and if you'll allow me. So I'm going to head up my structure again, and I'm going to go for management groups. And of course, inside my management groups, I'm going to have that worldwide commercial business. There's global technical learning, and there's subscriptions. Now I can go and give permissions at that level, right, at management group level, which will inherit all the way down. But what I really want to do is I want to click on my ATT sub here, and I want to scroll down a little bit, and you'll see that of course there's my resource groups and all those things. But if I scroll right to the top, there's access control, and I can go and view access for someone. So I can go and find someone, like for example, I can go and find myself. I've got my external account here, myburgh@gmail.com, on the tenant, and you'll see here that this specific role is got the ownership role, grants full access, and it inherits from this specific resource. All right. So what does that mean? Well, if I scroll down here and I go to my resource groups, and let's look at always on just as an example, and if I again click on my access control here, you will see that if I search again for myburgh@gmail.com, there we go, then it will show me also owner permissions here, grants full access, but it is inherited from the subscription, right? And the same will be down that resource group for additional resources. If I scroll down just a little bit here, there's Azure Cognitive Services inside of that resource group, and you can see here again, if I click on access control, that I can go and find myburgh@gmail.com here, and you'll see from there that the permissions is inheriting from the subscription. So the permissions inherit all the way from the top all the way down the structure into the individual resources. And yes, if I wanted to add an additional permission, you'll see there I can click on add the role assignment. The role assignment itself could be owner, it could be contributor or reader. What's the key difference there? If I make you the owner of a resource or of a resource group, you will be able to give someone else access as well. Right? If I make you a contributor, that role definition implies that you can manage the resource. So you can do whatever you need to do from an admin perspective, but you cannot give someone else additional access as well, right? Of course, the reader is pretty self-explanatory here, but this is the key difference here. The owner itself can add other people to have access. The contributor can just manage the resource, and the reader. Something else that we don't really have in the slides here, and you'll see if I scroll down a little bit, is we've got resource locks. This is another key capability in terms of your governance. When you finish deploying resources, you can select a given lock, and you will then select a lock to lock down the resources so no one else can go and either change the resources. And you'll see here we've got a read only option and we've got a delete option. Read only, by the way, implies delete. So why do we want to use these locks alongside the permissions? We can say, well, you might have permissions to manage the resource, but we don't want you to do something silly. We were all in that situation where we deleted something we shouldn't have deleted. And to that end, we can go and apply locks in the structure. So if I lock my resource group, I will not be able to change anything inside the resource group. So my suggestion is always, when you've finished deploying a resource, go and place a read-only lock on the resource. Provide some information for the users that might have permissions to come and delete the lock again, right? But once this lock is in place, you will not be able to make changes to the resource. These locks also inherit all the way down from a subscription. And if I scroll down here, you will see that there's my resource locks. So if I create a lock here, it will essentially lock everything in the structure downwards from here. All right, so that's just a list of the locks that I've actually got on my different individual resources. So these locks will inherit down. If I lock the subscription to be read only, you will not be able to make any changes to the subscription. Okay, so we've got permissions and we've got these locks I spoke about. And that kind of brings us to the end of this little session of ours. Maybe just in summary, there's a couple of ways that you can promote governance in your Azure subscription. You can use the structure or the taxonomy to ensure that that only the right permissions are being had in a certain structure, and isolate different resources, segregate those resources with a structure and taxonomy. And then last but not least, the policies and RBAC, where you can configure with policies how you want certain resources to be deployed, but also use RBAC to give permissions, right, to add access to in that structure. And that, ladies and gents. I hope that it's been valuable for you and that you've at least learned a couple of things. Enjoy the rest of the Global Azure Bootcamp. Johan Myburgh here from South Africa signing out. Have a great evening.